pawn f3, knight c6, bishop e3, pawn a6, queen d2, rook b8, rook b1, castles kingside, pawn b4, pawn e5, pawn d5, knight d4, knight g1, e2, pawn c5, pawn takes c6, pawn takes c6, knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook e8, bishop e2, pawn c5, pawn takes c5, knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, queen h4, pawn g3, rook takes b1, king f2, rook b2, pawn takes h4, rook takes d2, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, king e3, rook c2, king d3, rook takes c3, king takes c3, pawn takes c5, bishop d3, bishop b7, rook e1, rook e5, pawn a4, pawn f5, rook b1, bishop takes e4, rook b6, pawn f4, rook takes a6, pawn f3, bishop f1, bishop f5, rook a7, king h6, king d2, pawn f2, bishop e2, bishop g4, bishop d3, rook e1, bishop g4, bishop d3, rook e1, rook f7, bishop f5, pawn a5, bishop takes d3, rook takes f2, rook f1, pawn c4, pawn g6, pawn e4, bishop g7, pawn d4, pawn d6, knight c3, knight f6, pawn f3, castles kingside, bishop e3, knight b8, d7, bishop d3, pawn c5, knight g1, e2, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, pawn e6, castles kingside, pawn d5, pawn e4 takes d5, pawn takes d5, bishop f2, knight e5, pawn c5, knight f6, d7, bishop e2, knight takes c5, knight d4, b5, pawn b6, knight takes d5, bishop f5, knight d4, bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d5, bishop c2, rook a8, d8, queen e2, rook f8, e8, rook f1, e1, knight takes f3, queen takes f3, rook takes e1, rook takes e1, bishop takes d4, queen takes d5, rook takes d5, rook e2, bishop takes b2, bishop takes c5, rook takes c5, pawn g3, pawn b5, king g2, bishop e5, bishop b3, pawn a5, rook f2, rook c7, rook e2, bishop c3, rook e8, king g7, rook b8, pawn a4, bishop d5, rook c5, bishop e4, pawn b4, bishop c2, bishop e5, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, pawn f3. Castles kingside. Bishop g5, pawn a6, queen d2, knight b8, d7, knight h3, pawn c5, pawn d5, pawn b5, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, bishop takes b5, bishop a6. Castles kingside. Queen a5, pawn a4, rook f8, b8, rook a3, knight b6, queen e2, knight f6, d7, bishop d2, bishop takes b5, knight takes b5, queen a6, pawn b3, knight c8, bishop c1, knight a7, knight c3, queen b6, knight b1, knight e5, knight f2, knight c8, pawn f4, knight d7, knight d2, queen a6, queen takes a6, rook takes a6, knight d3, pawn f5, pawn e5, knight c8, b6, knight c4, knight takes c4, pawn takes c4, rook b8, a8, bishop b2, knight b6, rook c1, knight takes a4, rook b3, knight takes b2, rook takes b2, rook a3, rook d2, rook b3, king f1, rook a8, a3, king e2, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, rook e3, king f2, rook takes e5, rook e2, rook takes e2, king takes E2, King F7, King F2, Rook D3, Rook A1, Rook C3, Rook A7, Rook takes C4, Pawn D6, Rook F4, King G3, Rook E4, Rook C7, King E6, Pawn takes E7, King D6, Pawn E8, Rook takes E8, Rook takes H7, Pawn C4, Pawn D4, Knight F6, Pawn C4, Pawn G6, Knight C3, Bishop G7, Pawn E4, Pawn D6, Pawn F3, Castles kingside, Bishop E3, Pawn A6, Bishop D3, Pawn C5, Pawn takes C5, Pawn takes C5, Bishop takes C5, Knight C6, Knight G1, E2, Knight D7, Bishop F2, Knight D7, E5, Knight C1, Bishop H6, Knight D5, Pawn E6, Bishop B6, Queen G5, Castles kingside, Pawn takes D5, Pawn F4, Queen H4, Pawn takes E5, Pawn D4, Knight E2, Bishop E3, King H1, Knight takes E5, Bishop C7, Queen E7, Bishop takes E5, Queen takes E5, Queen E1, Bishop D7, Queen G3, Rook A8, E8, Knight F4, Bishop C6, Knight D5, Queen takes G3, Pawn takes G3, Rook E5, Pawn G4, Pawn H5, Knight F6, King G7. Pawn takes H5. Rook H8. Pawn G3. Rook E5 takes H5. Knight takes H5. Rook takes H5. King G2. Pawn F5. Rook A1, E1. Pawn takes E4. Bishop B1. Rook C5. Pawn B3. Pawn B5. Rook takes E3. Pawn takes E3. Rook E1. Pawn takes C4. Pawn takes C4. Rook takes C4. Rook takes E3. Rook B4. Rook B3. Pawn E3. King F1. Bishop B5. King E1. Pawn A5. Bishop E4. Rook takes B3. Pawn takes B3. King F6. King D1. Pawn G5. King C2. King E5. Bishop G6. King D4. Pawn D4. Knight F6. Pawn C4. Pawn G6. Knight C3. Bishop G7. Pawn E4. Pawn D6. Pawn F3. Castles kingside. Bishop E3. Knight C6. Queen D2. Pawn A6. Knight G1, E2. Rook E8. Knight C1. Pawn E5. Pawn D5. Knight D4. Knight C1, E2. Pawn C5. Pawn takes C6. Knight takes C6. Knight D5. Pawn B5. Bishop B6. Queen D7. Knight C7. Rook B8. Knight takes E8. Queen takes E8. Bishop E3. Pawn takes C4. Knight C3. Bishop E6. Bishop E2. Knight D4. Castles kingside. Pawn D5. Pawn takes D5. Knight takes D5. Knight takes D5. Bishop takes D5. Rook F2. Pawn H5. Rook C1. Queen E6. Bishop F1. Pawn H4. Rook E1. Queen C6. Bishop H6. Bishop H8. Pawn F4. Pawn E4. Rook D1. Bishop E6. Pawn F5. Knight takes F5. Queen F4. Rook E8. Rook F2 D2. Queen C5. King H1. Bishop E5. Queen G5. King H7. Rook D8. Rook takes D8. Rook takes D8. Queen F2. Rook D1. Knight takes H6. Queen takes E5. Pawn E3. Queen C3. Rook D1. Knight takes H6. Queen takes E5. Pawn E3. Queen C3. Pawn H3. Queen E1. Knight G4. Pawn D4. Knight F6. Pawn C4. Pawn G6. Knight C3. Bishop G7. Pawn E4. Pawn D6. Pawn F3. Castles kingside. Bishop E3. Knight C6. Knight G1 E2. Rook B8. Queen D2. Pawn A6. Rook D1. Rook E8. Knight C1. Pawn E5. Knight B3. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Pawn d5. Pawn c4 takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight takes d4. Bishop c4. Pawn c5. Pawn a3. Bishop e6. Castles kingside. Pawn b5. Bishop a2. Pawn b4. Bishop c4. Pawn takes a3. Pawn takes a3. Rook b2. Queen d3. Queen a5. Rook f2. Rook e8 b8. Rook takes b2. Rook takes b2. Rook d2. Rook takes d2. Bishop takes d2. Queen a4. Bishop e3. Pawn a5. Pawn h3. Pawn h5. Pawn h4. King h7. King h2. Queen d7. Bishop f4. Queen b7. Queen d2. Queen b1. Bishop d6. Pawn a4. Bishop d3. Queen b3. Knight c7. Pawn c4. Knight takes e6. Pawn takes e6. Bishop f1. Pawn c3. Queen g5. Pawn c2. Bishop f4. Queen takes a3. Bishop c4. Queen b4. Bishop a2. Queen b2. Bishop c4. Knight takes f3. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Knight g1 e2. Pawn C6. Queen D2. Knight B8, D7. Rook D1. Pawn A6. Pawn takes E5. Knight takes E5. Pawn B3. Pawn B5. Pawn takes B5. Pawn A6 takes B5. Queen takes D6. Knight F6, D7. Pawn F4. Pawn B4. Knight B1. Knight G4. Bishop D4. Bishop takes D4. Queen takes D4. Rook takes A2. Pawn H3. Pawn C5. Queen G1. Knight G4, F6. Pawn E5. Knight E4. Pawn H4. Pawn C4. Knight C1. Pawn C3. Knight takes A2. Pawn C2. Queen D4. Pawn takes D1. King takes D1. Knight D7, C5. Queen takes D8. Rook takes D8. King C2. Knight F2. Rook G1. Bishop F5. King C1. Rook D1. King B2. Rook takes B1. Pawn D4. Knight F6. Pawn C4. Pawn G6. Knight C3. Bishop G7. Pawn E4. Pawn D6. Pawn F3. Castles kingside. Bishop E3. Pawn E5. Knight G1, E2. Pawn C6. Queen D2. Knight B8, D7. Castles queenside. Pawn A6. King B1. Pawn B5. Knight C1. Pawn takes D4. Bishop takes D4. Rook E8. Bishop takes F6. Queen takes F6. Queen takes D6. Queen takes d6. Rook takes d6. Knight e5. Pawn f4. Knight g4. Pawn e5. Knight f2. Rook t1. Bishop f5. King a1. Pawn b4. Knight a4. Pawn f6. Pawn e6. Rook takes e6. Rook takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Bishop e2. Pawn f5. Knight b3. Bishop f7. Knight a5. Rook d8. Rook f1. Knight g4. Rook d1. Rook takes d1. Bishop takes d1. Knight e3. Bishop f3. Knight takes c4. Knight takes c6. Pawn a5. Knight d8. Knight d2. Bishop c6. Bishop h6. Pawn g3. Knight f1. Knight b6. Knight takes h2. Knight d7. Bishop g7. Knight e5. Bishop takes e5. Pawn takes e5. King f8. Pawn e6. Bishop e8. Bishop takes e8. King takes e8. Knight c6. Knight f1. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Pawn d5. Knight h5. Queen d2. Pawn f5. Castles queenside. Knight d7. Bishop d3. Knight c5. Bishop c2. pawn a6, knight g1, e2, pawn b5, pawn b4, knight d7, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, knight takes b5, rook takes a2, knight e2, c3, rook a8, king b2, knight d7, f6, knight a7, pawn takes e4, knight c6, queen d7, pawn g4, knight f4, pawn g5, knight f6 takes d5, knight takes d5, knight d3, bishop takes d3, pawn takes d3, knight c6, e7, king h8, knight takes c8, pawn e4, knight c3, queen a4, rook a1, queen takes b4, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, pawn f3, castles kingside, bishop e3, pawn e5, pawn d5, pawn c6, queen d2, pawn takes d5, pawn c4 takes d5, pawn a6, bishop d3, knight h5, pawn g4, knight f4, bishop c2, pawn b5, queen f2, knight d7, knight g1, e2, pawn b4, knight a4, pawn a5, knight takes f4, pawn takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight e5, castles queenside, knight c4, bishop e3, knight takes e3, queen takes e3, rook b8, bishop b3, bishop d7, king b1, queen e8, knight b6, bishop b5, rook d2, pawn a4, bishop d1, rook b7, pawn e5, pawn b3, pawn takes b3, pawn takes b3, bishop takes b3, queen b8, knight c4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes e5, queen e2, queen a7, rook c1, rook a8, pawn b3, bishop f4, king c2, rook e7, queen d3, queen c5, rook b1, rook e3, queen d4, rook a2, king d1, rook takes f3, queen takes f4, rook takes f4, rook takes a2, queen g1, king c2, queen takes h2, pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn g6, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, pawn f3, castles kingside, bishop e3, pawn e5, pawn d5, pawn c6, bishop d3, pawn b5, pawn takes b5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, pawn e4, knight takes e4, knight takes d5, bishop g5, queen a5, queen d2, queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, bishop takes b2, rook b1, bishop g7, knight e2, knight d7, knight takes d6. Knight c5. Bishop c2. Bishop e6. Knight e4. Rook a8, c8. Castles kingside. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Pawn f5. Bishop d3. Knight b6. Knight c1. Rook f8, d8. Bishop g5. Rook d7. Rook e1. King f7. Bishop e2. Pawn h6. Bishop h4. Knight d5. Bishop d1. Bishop d4. Bishop f2. Bishop takes f2. King takes f2. Knight c3. Bishop b3. Bishop takes b3. Rook takes b3. Knight d1. Rook takes d1. Rook takes d1. Knight d3. Rook d2. King e3. Rook takes g2. Rook a3. Rook e8. King d4. Rook e7. Knight e5. King f6. Knight c6. Rook d7. King c4. Rook c2. King b4. Rook takes h2. Rook a6. King g5. Pawn a4. Pawn h5. Rook takes a7. Rook takes a7. Knight takes a7. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Pawn f3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Knight c3. Castles kingside. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Knight g1, e2. Pawn c6. Queen d2. Knight b8, d7. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn c4 takes d5. Pawn a6. Knight g3. Pawn h5. Bishop d3. Pawn b5. Castles kingside. Pawn h4. Knight g3 e2. Knight h5. Pawn a4. Pawn b4. Knight a2. Knight c5. Bishop c4. Pawn a5. Bishop takes c5. Pawn takes c5. Knight a2, c1. King h7. Knight b3. Bishop h6. Queen d3. Queen d6. Bishop b5. Pawn c4. Bishop takes c4. King g7. Bishop b5. Queen b6. King h1. Rook h8. Pawn d6. Bishop e6. Bishop c4. Bishop takes c4. Queen takes c4. Queen takes d6. Rook a1, d1. Queen e7. Queen b5. Bishop e3. Rook d7. Knight g3. Knight takes g3. Pawn takes g3. Pawn h3. Queen e6. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Pawn d5. Pawn c6. Queen d2. Pawn takes d5. Pawn c4 takes d5. Knight b8, d7. Knight g1, e2. Pawn a6. Knight c1. Knight h5. Bishop d3. Pawn f5. Knight c1, e2. Knight d7, f6. Pawn takes f5. Pawn takes f5. Knight g3. Pawn e4. Knight takes h5. Knight takes h5. Pawn takes e4. Pawn f4. Bishop f2. Bishop g4. Pawn h3. Bishop d7. Castles queenside. Bishop e5. King b1. Queen f6. Bishop e2. Knight g3. Bishop takes g3. Pawn takes g3. Bishop f3. Rook a8, c8. Knight e2. Queen g6. Rook c1. Rook takes c1. Queen takes c1. Rook c8. Queen e3. Queen f6. Queen d2. Rook c5. Knight c1. Bishop f4. Queen b4. Bishop b5. Knight b3. Bishop d3. King a1. Rook c2. Rook b1. Bishop e5. Knight c1. Bishop takes b2. Queen takes b2. Queen takes b2. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn g6. Knight c3. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Pawn d6. Pawn f3. Castles kingside. Bishop e3. Pawn e5. Knight g1, e2. Pawn c6. Queen d2. Knight b8, d7. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn c4 takes d5. Pawn a6. Pawn g4. Pawn h5. Pawn h3. Pawn b5. Bishop g5. Queen a5. Knight d1. Queen takes d2. King takes D2. Knight C5. Knight F2. Bishop D7. Pawn takes H5. Knight takes H5. Bishop E7. Rook F8, C8. Bishop takes D6. Knight B7. Bishop E7. Pawn F6. Knight D3. King F7. Bishop A3. Pawn A5. Pawn B4. Knight D6. King D1. Pawn takes B4. Bishop takes B4. Knight C4. King C2. Bishop F8. Knight C3. Bishop takes B4. Knight takes B4. Rook A3. Knight C6. Bishop takes C6. Pawn takes C6. Rook takes C6. Knight takes B5. Rook takes F3. Bishop takes C4. Rook takes C4. King D2. King G7. Rook H1, C1. Rook takes E4. Rook C7. King G8. Rook C8. King H7. Rook C7. Knight G7. Knight D6. Rook F2. King C3. Rook E4. E2.